Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Dyrrhachion fought on October the 18th, 1081 between the Byzantine Empire led by the Emperor Alexios I Comnenus, who made a video about him a couple of weeks ago, and the Normans of southern Italy under Robert of Hauteville, Robert Guiscard, Duke of Apulia and Calabria. This is actually one of the most famous battles of the period and of medieval history in general. It was fought just outside the city of Dyrrhachion, that is present-day Dyrrhachion in Albania. You can call the battle of Dyrrhachium, the Latin way, or Durazzo, even the Italian one. I use the Greek one because, generally speaking, this was in a more sort of Byzantine context, but it's not that relevant. What is relevant instead is, of course, the tactical reconstruction that, as you know, we make in our battle series that, as you know, has a very particular regard towards sources, because as a living I do exactly this. I reconstruct mostly battles, and as a medievalist, like, I must evidently provide the audience with the primary sources. Secondly, because it's just an exercise that, just like the whole Schwerpunkt, I make for myself, as I want really to have that encyclopedistic knowledge about every single battle, and therefore not just, say, following somebody else's interpretation. I, however, found John Haldon's reconstruction of Dyrrhachion essentially correct. There are a couple of things I will also in fact highlight that the author does not take in consideration, but the video is based, as we will see now, on the major sources on the Battle of Dyrrhachion, the contemporary ones, and primarily the Alexiad of Anna Comnenus, daughter of the same Alexios I that fought in the battle. And I will proceed in a slightly different way than the usual for this battle, because normally I sort of tell like the story more or less, citing, say, every source, every step of the way of telling you essentially where you can find the information, like in which source in fact. I think this battle is so beautiful, especially from the accounts, that it's a pity not to read them directly, as we already did sometimes, right? This will break a little bit the sequence that I will place in the mid video that I prepared about the very simple, clear scheme of the battle deployment and development, which is, after all, fairly simple, but that in fact must be understood properly from the sources, right? Normally I would also, say, provide with more detail, or at least even some sort of personal take on, for example, we've seen it recently in the Battle of Pelagonia, like, where do we think that certain troops were placed, in which battle line, and in this case mostly like the sections of the same, which unfortunately for the Battle of Dyrrhachion is not entirely clear at all. In fact, we are quite lucky to have these beautiful sources telling us enough about the general battle dynamic that for the times and the places, but especially the times, it's not to be given for granted, right? But that, of course, cannot, like in the 11th, even the beginning of the 12th century, depending like on dating, you cannot really know normally. So I will actually make a sort of broader introduction that will illustrate the political and strategical situation, especially the Byzantine one is already covered in multiple videos that I made on Alexios, especially one about the very beginning of his reign, and so how he coped, in fact, with this Norman threat. Also, the Pechenegs were around making trouble. So that's a bit more of a sort of more broadly ranged one. In this videos, we tend to just introduce the minimal, indispensable information about the political and strategical background. Then we just take this deep dive into the battle itself from a merely tactical point of view. All right, but this battle is so important in a broader sense that it's it's impossible not to be fascinated with a bit more with the broader context. Some information that we know about the battle, also in the regarding the numbers, the units, we will read, in fact, in this first part, because the information is scattered also in previous paragraphs of the chapters that we will be reading. Therefore, in order to not to talk about other stuff that really does not add too much to the actual tactical development, I will simply, cite them before. But then you have also Godfrey Malater, you have William of Apulia, you have the Annals of Lupus Protospatarius. So we will be reading those. Just most of the information is contained essentially in first two more important sources. And so we will also see how essentially we do not know something about the battle that would be very crucial to understand, especially the decisive moment of the same. Again, it's completely normal not to know, and so always beware of also YouTube channels that tend to make all the nice sort of animation that obviously must have must have had some decision behind in order to show the single version. I'm sure there are videos that also tell you, well, we do not know exactly what happened, or here's the other version, but normally for sort of cinematic reasons and or just the simplicity of the war, they tend just to give you that picture and say, okay, this is how it went, right? But that doesn't quite belong to unless you properly provide with a sound explanation, which unfortunately for this kind of sources now in the 11th century is not really available. And that's something you can start doing with some degree of accuracy for the second half of the 13th century, right? We have seen it also in other battles, and or at least if the single accounts are just clear and schematic enough, even though they may be also relatively unreliable. But never distrust narrative sources, right? That's unfortunately a bias that has been matured in a particular part of Western academia, and it's not positive at all, because without narrative sources, we do not know practically anything about what happened during battles, and I will make more videos to violently demonstrate this, because it's not really a matter of personal opinion, right? And there is a broader wisdom that one must have, the moral and scientific sensitivity to understand. So, as we know, this time was quite troubled for the Byzantine Empire. Alexios' reign began in 1081, facing significant strategic challenges, to say the least, as the Byzantines were struggling to recover from the attacks launched by the Pechenegs on the Danube, the Normans, like in this case in Epirus, and the Turks in Anatolia. I made back in the day, in the very beginning of Schwerpunkt, a video about Manzikert that I think is the only one who went completely lost during the re-upload stuff, and it was not really bad, really, except at the time I had even poorer speaking skills than I have today, so I'm sure that I will make another video about Manzikert, right? That battle is also very instructive. As a matter of fact, to some extent, even more than this one, that, as we'll see, has lots of interesting details, but also gets down to something that we do not fully get. Of course, also Manzikert has some question marks, but it's really It's really very interesting. You know that the Turks had basically taken over the Anatolian hinterland, and the Byzantines controlled basically just the coastal part of the region, and being threatened from further pressure from that front, and now these other enemies were also taking advantage of it. So in late May 1081, Robert Guiscard, the Norman duke and a member of the Hauteville clan from northern France, and had established a substantial territory for himself in southern Italy, landed at Avlona on the Albanian coast with the intention of seizing the territory in the Western Balkans for himself. We made multiple videos on the Siculo-Normans, but really they're too few. I don't know why from the cycle we got so few content about the Normans. In general, we have to recover, and this video will hopefully help for that as well. Before this expedition was a major regional one. The Siculo-Normans were really the number one threat to the integrity of the Byzantine Empire, right? And they would remain so for a long time. They would keep inflicting this sort of very nasty and deep, say, losses and attacks to imperial territory, the structure in it considerably. Robert had already taken, in fact, Bari in Apulia, that had historically been like a Greek city. Like, these were properly the centers, the coastal ones that historically had remained, like, also separated apart from the hinterland, as properly Greek ports, if you want, in Italy. And that was a bit like the most important center of the same Apulia, as well as the last Byzantine stronghold in Italy by that time. We are 10 years before 1071, so you understand how, like, here all the chronology also with Manzikert is intertwining. Guiscard had firm designs on acquiring Byzantine territories in the Balkans, because obviously this would secure the Adriatic and the Ionian control, would allow further access to Byzantine territory, would allow, as a matter of fact, to threaten the same Constantinople, which was the ultimate objective, and the Hauteville wouldn't make any attempt to hide this. They were quite vocal about it, on the contrary. This was the Hauteville's first and long-planned move against the empire. Robert Guiscard's landing in Epirus was unopposed, because essentially, like, the Byzantines had still to prepare the field army to counter him, and by mid-June 1081, the Siculo-Norman forces had marched northwards to encircle and lay siege to Dyrrhachion, so now known as Dyrrhachion, the regional center, in fact, of Epirus, a massive and, as we'll see now, well-defended Byzantine fortress. That would in fact provoke its fall, like a major, destabilization of the further inland Balkan territories. The Normans, you know how this battle ends. But they would eventually penetrate into Thessaly. They would cause pretty big mess, and Alexios somehow managed quite successfully and, say, equilibristically to pull off at least the feat of not making the empire collapse at that point. Now, the city of Dyrrhachion was located in an extremely advantageous position on a long and narrow peninsula that ran parallel to the coast, but was essentially separated from it by a brackish and marshy lagoon. I have a picture here of the map. And the defensive system was pretty powerful. The fortifications of the city dated back to the 6th century AD. They had been meticulously maintained, and Dyrrhachion was well equipped to withstand a prolonged siege, for which the Siculo-Normans were actually in some trouble since the beginning of the expedition, even before the Byzantine army of relief approached them. Robert, that was himself commanding the Norman army, had also a fleet at his disposal, and because of course, like besieging a coastal city was, requiring forcefully like some naval capacity as well. And his initial plan was to in fact attempt to capture the city by launching a simultaneous attack from both land and water. This endeavor was, however, overly ambitious to an extent, given the strength of the city's defenses and the size of Dyrrhachion's garrison. However, before Robert's plan could be put into action, there was another, complication, to say the least, arriving. That was the Emperor's allies, the Venetians, sending a substantial fleet to fight against the same Siculo-Norman one. Right? You know that this is also, as we've seen in the video about Alexios Comnenus, the moment in which essentially the Venetians win their golden bowl. They see their privileges in the Byzantine Empire increasing radically, to the point they basically get the subcontract of the fact of the imperial naval capacity. So we're talking about some fanatically advanced enemies, like Venice as the product of the Italian maritime communal capacity, the Siculo-Normans, properly with the most advanced Western Frankish feudal capacity, and you see how independently from the side, the Byzantines are fundamentally obliged to cope with them without much of a choice, both as allies as enemies. As we'll see now, there were Norman forces from the same, independent Norman forces from the same Byzantine side, as a matter of fact, as well as later on, Dyrrhachion's gates would be opened by a treacherous Venetian to the Normans, which is interesting. So in this context, like there are some passages that are objectively very funny, such as the Venetian ships passing by the ones of Bohemond of Taranto, that was Guiscard's son, as you know, would go on to fight also against the Byzantines in the future, would found the Principality of Antioch during the First Crusade, etc., and essentially being mocked by the Venetians for his beard, so sort of Norman-style beard, and so taking on the same Italian fleet, but being totally defeated by it in a decisive battle as far as the Siculo-Norman capacity of countering the Byzantines, in this case their Venetian allies at sea, was concerned, which, as you understand, was a severe blow to the entire Siculo-Norman campaign, because without naval support, things were quickly tilting in favor of the Byzantines. And Dyrrhachion's garrison took advantage of this unexpected turn of events to launch a surprise attack on the Norman forces, also inflicting important casualty on them as well, which tells you also how sort of balanced the forces were, right? Because if, of course, like with now all the logistical issues that were coming from the destruction of the Siculo-Norman fleet, the Siculo-Normans were feeling weaker and sort of less motivated, and they would also be susceptible to an attack of the garrison that was quite substantial, and that felt confident now to take on their enemies. However, the Siculo-Normans held on, De facto now, Robert's army was blockaded from the sea. The situation was rapidly deteriorating due to an epidemic that broke out over the following weeks in their camp, and a large number of both ordinary troops and knights, that, as you know, the latter constituting really the spearhead of the Siculo-Norman forces, became unable to fight due to illness. And in spite of these setbacks, however, Robert continued in his enterprise, risking really a lot in all this, maintaining the siege and keeping the enemy under pressure. The Emperor Alexios I, who, as we've seen, had been recently enthroned, decided that this was the right moment to march westwards to drive off the invaders, since the Siculo-Normans presented a significant threat to the Empire's Balkan provinces, and considering especially the complete loss of control over the Anatolian hinterland, Constantinople could not afford to lose the European part of the empire. So as the emperor marched to confront Robert, it was the right strategical decision. Guiscard wouldn't lose time and built a number of siege engines with which he proceeded to bombard the garrison of Dyrrhachion in an effort to wear it down, right, while at the same time being quite wary of the Byzantine forces sending out scouts and having different sources communicating with him regarding the approaching imperial field army, which was really, say, upsetting. We'll see now, overlooked aspect of this campaign is Robert's decision to risk. In the meanwhile, Alexios Comnenus, that was at Thessaloniki, received reports of a sally by the Dyrrhachion garrison that had been less successful than the previous one, resulting in some casualties, including the commander George Palaiologos, who received an arrow in the temple, but also managed to survive. Additionally, consider the Normans were also bringing with them crossbows and say forms that, as you know, had never really disappeared in Europe from ancient times, and now were sort of developing them in an effective way, mainly against cavalry, and having fundamentally a superior firepower than even the importantly archery say assisted Byzantine one, as we will see also in this battle. Additionally, as Alexios marched on, he received a report that Guiscard had now built a large siege tower that threatened the walls of Dyrrhachion. Now, we are getting towards the battle, and we have to make some approximations regarding the actual sizes of the armies. It's really difficult to say how big these armies were in relation to one another. First of all, we're talking about fairly archaic times, for which, yes, even in the presence of a regional mobilization, you would hardly manage to reach the sort of suitable number of 30,000 men, right? Anna Comnena actually states that the Normans had approximately something like that, comprising, she says, a corps of around 1,300 heavily armored cavalrymen, supported by lighter cavalry and a significant contingent of infantry and foot soldiers in general, including missile, the sense, as we'll see from the account, is that some of these troops were of questionable quality, which would specifically refer to the Lombard and say southern Italians, and sometimes they were the same thing, because as you know, like also Robert's wife that we will see now in combat was a Lombard from southern Italy. But when we say Normans, we're actually using a synecdoche, especially in this case where there were lots of, not just the Normans were technically Western Franks, but there were also Germans, Lombards of, say, northern Italy, that were Occitanians. And the idea is that especially the infantry, so coming from certain parts of Italy, would be sort of less qualitative compared, of course, to the knights, say, which is debatable in the sense that for infantry, we know that Italians had actually like the finest footmen around, and there is just an episode that will make you understand better what Anna was referring to in combat. There could have been a way to sort of depreciate, because the Byzantines were not as feudal as the Normans, but as you know, quite haughty, and also in a social sense, say, your foot soldiers, they're not so important. Like, it's just like, this Frankish influenced historiography also in the Western side. There was all a debate, by the way, whether Amna Komnena had read, some Norman sources here, but it's possible. But if you read the account, like the thing that matters is the single information after all. And if that had been the case, at least for building upon that information, which is essentially agreeing with the same sources, so actually it's a winner. The infantry is not much considered. However, when we look at the numbers for the whole army, when you say 1,300 heavily armored cavalrymen, which is a lot, right? But in fact, also for this reason, quite heavy. In a typical Western army of this time, infantry would have not been, if we're talking properly of fighting force, so not just field aids, etc. We do not know here what Anna really means by 30,000. Like, yes, you said she's intense soldiers as a force, but it could have been broadly sort of a bit exaggerated. Actually, I do think that the Siculo-Normans were inferior in number to the Byzantines, which doesn't mean that they were, in this sense, in disadvantage, because the Western army was in qualitatively tougher, right? So for 1,300 heavily armored cavalrymen, I would say that the infantry could have not been more than 10 times that number. So I doubt that the Norman army in that context was realistically larger than 15,000, right? I can be wrong. This is just my general impression. And even in infantry, these guys would have had consistently better footmen than the Byzantines had, right? So actually, the idea of the questionable quality is also to be discussed, because we made a video regarding Byzantine warfare exactly between the 11th and the 14th century, and we were including, if you remember, the description of the very Apulian, say, town militias that would have historically been organized in a Byzantine fashion, in order that was very similar to the one of the Lombard interland, right? And that, albeit the Byzantine government in these areas having sort of collapsed, not being particularly functional, and actually having allowed the same rise of the Normans as mercenaries for the local Lombard princes, the Byzantine forces now would, the Byzantine militias that now were actually controlled by the same Normans, were not bad, right? They were not, like, say, professional troops. They were not habituated to venture much out of their towns, but they were, like, in terms of per capita wealth, general, like, organization, like, not bad infantry at all, right? And especially considering the ratio cost benefits, like in terms also of size of their contingents. So actually we can say that the Norman heavy cavalry was well assisted, not just by some lighter cavalry, some sort of squires, sergeants, etc., but also fairly reliable foot soldiers that, of course, as we will see during the battle, from one side of the Norman detachment would flee, but they would do also because like the entire formation, and including cavalry, would, and they had been attacked they were from the flank fundamentally while they were engaged against another enemy. And so that doesn't tell us that they weren't necessarily like of poor quality, but let's say the elites would malignate a bit, because Anna, as we will see now, has a fantastic and she's a very famous historical character, but also her prose is so pleasant to read. And so, that as a Byzantine, she used to insert some topoi in many ways, and we will see better like which parts of the story sound more or less idealistic. And Alden, by the way, agrees that 30,000 men is too much, right? But I think he still puts the Normans at numerical advantage, which again I don't think so, mostly because their type of troops would be more costly. And actually, the Byzantines, even though they were in dire straits, no doubt, empire-wide, would be able to bring, say, more, but also lighter forces that, in fact, would not be able. So this is how the battle really goes, like able to withstand the frontal shock of the Norman cavalry charge, which is actually the big deal here. So the same sort of Western Frankish culture against the Byzantine, but also as we'll see now, also the Anglo-Norse one that, in fact, would make this battle a sort of say Mediterranean Hastings, given the fact that, as you know, many Anglo-Saxon refugees had been welcomed at Constantinople in the Varangian Guard. So much so that we see now the sources, the same Frankish sources say these are basically Angles. They're not, say, Scandinavians. Which, I mean, they were quite similar in that way. We're talking mostly at the time of Hastings, not much of an Anglo-Saxon, an Anglo-Danish society, right? But there were lots of, of those guys from the other side, as well as Frankish mercenaries that, as we've seen also at Manzikert, were with the Byzantines. So it's all very interesting. We unfortunately don't know the actual size of the various contingents. We have to sort of guess, and here I substantially disagree with Haldon. I think that also the exercise of providing Haldon said that there were so many, so what the hell does he know? Like, it's just a guess, right? And the battle itself does not lend itself, in fact, for saying, oh my god, were these troops from this side, for this from other, we can make the mathematics of it. No, right? So it's also kind of useless. And I do believe, actually, that the Byzantines may have been superior in number without too much problem to the Siculo-Normans. We have some information of the various contingents that formed the Byzantine army. Right. We do not know, however, in most cases, how big they were. We can imagine, of course, that Alexios had with him the Thracian and Macedonian tagmata, which sort of makes sense. These were the imperial regiments, say the regulars of Europe. We may think this force counting some 1,000 men. Then we know that there were the excubita, that were a unit of the guard, so elite forces. We do not know how many. There were maybe around 1,000. Then the Vistia Ritae, another elite unit of the guard, maybe the same number. We do know explicitly of Frankish mercenary knights in the Byzantine army, commanded by Constantine Umbertopoulos, which is interesting because like means the son of Humbert, right? And in Greek, so you see these names like probably of Western Frankish origin in the Byzantine army. We have, interestingly enough, the core of the Manichaeans, consisting precisely, this Anna says, 2,800 men. I have an idea that you will see from the pictures that these, the Franks, the Manichaeans, that were sort of very valid men. The units, the guard units, would have been in the center with Alexios, we will see now. But the former would have instead been stationed on the wing of the Byzantine army, because they were sort of, say, better suited for the attack, and as we will see in battle, like managing to actually, in fact, temporarily break the Siculo-Norman right in front of them. But it's just my guess. We do not really know, unfortunately, where these troops were stationed in the Byzantine array. Then we have various stigmata of Thessalian cavalry as well, so these other forces from the southern part of the empire. We do not know how many there were. We know that there were 2,000 Turkish mercenaries from Anatolia. These were essentially Byzantine allies because, as you know, everything was fragmented. In theory, this Sultanate of Iconium had like an hegemony of Anatolia, but there were so many different Turkish princes, and we'd also say troops coming from also very different places at their service, and they had come to help because they imagined that a further blow against the empire would have sort of endangered within the same Anatolia their decentralized position from the major Seljuk power. We truly know of the presence of levies from Thrace, other Balkan provinces. We know of a contingent of Armenians that, as we've seen in a video about the historical unit types, were quite prominent numerically in the Byzantine army. And again, we do not know how many there were. Haldon goes by several thousand. Even I'm not sure whether he has actually made the math entirely. Like this would make a substantially. He's not incorrect regarding the prominence of the Armenians, but just I doubt we can properly even say anything about the numbers. The say more noticeable force here in as we'll see now, that was very important for the battle dynamic, were famously enough the Varangians of the guard. We do not know how many these were. Haldon says that they were 1,400 strong, but actually we're told by some contemporary Byzantine sources that there were larger contingents of Varangians, and we often conceive the Varangians just as the guard, but we forget there were sort of lots of other sort of military settlers, also of not, say, elite character, coming from Scandinavia, settled across the Balkans. I think, and I will explain why, because essentially in the deployment, these Varangians would be stationed in front of the Byzantine center and essentially acting alone without apparently, say, and this is the point because we do not know how many they were, but like without the wings, without all that, what we think was the complete Byzantine army behind. And so 1,400 is too few, right? They could have been, say, maybe in the heavier part, something like it. But I think that the Varangians here were in the multiple thousands, not just so few. And this also, by the way, Haldon at the end says that most of these guys were annihilated. I think that, also we do not have much evidence that this is mathematically the case during the rout, etc. So I think it's more likely that there were more, that they wouldn't get all killed, in spite of their mostly picked nature, but not all. Also, as we will understand now better also in which function on the battlefield, there was a number of light infantry archers and slingers which would protect especially the Varangians in combat. We can imagine, especially among the Byzantine cavalry, to have there been like lots of horse archers. Here we have the literal Turks. There were some same Pechenegs that Alexios had been fighting with. There are also some other Balkan auxiliaries. We know specifically of some Serbians that apparently would also essentially escape the field without engaging when they saw that things were going wrong for the Byzantines. We'll all read it from the account now. But unfortunately, we do not have any idea where these troops were stationed. I mean, of course, yes, with the Emperor, there would be the guard units. Aside from the Varangians, as we'll see now, they were explicitly stationed in the front, like as a separate line. But again, about the other troops, we know zero, unfortunately. And for the Normans, it's pretty much the same, because we do not even know whether... We just know the names of the commanders for each side of the... say for each, the center and the wings, right? But not really what kind of troops they commanded. So I would give to the Byzantines a size of, in the numerical strength, of 20,000 to be conservative as well. So the engagement would be technically between some 13,000 Siculo-Normans and 15,000, say, Byzantines, broadly meant with all these other allies, etc. Right? So that sort of makes sense to me, and it's plausible, really. Now, going back to the strategical situation, here there was a general problem because the terrain was pretty favorable to the Byzantines. As you have seen also from the map, essentially the Norman camp was situated at the end of the aforementioned peninsula, in front of say, where the Dyrrhachion stood, and if the Byzantines had simply just approached the enemy and kept him under pressure, the Normans would have if they had stayed in their camp, they would have been worn out. They could have been crushed, as a matter of fact, by the combined effort between the Byzantine field army arriving from the hinterland and the Dyrrhachion's garrison. Or they would, as it happened when the forces also gave battle, they could have just attracted the Normans out by encamping somewhere else and not wanting really to, or more distant from them, not wanting to give fight and, say, harassing them and wearing them out. Instead, Alexios opts for essentially a direct attack to at least expectedly, say, at least exposing his own army and leaving the choice of whether to give battle or not to the Normans, sort of offering to them at the end of the day. The same emperor had sought the counsel of his senior officers, including George Palaiologos, who had visited him in his camp. At this point, the Dyrrhachion's garrison had successfully destroyed the first siege towers built by the Normans, and they were building yet a second. So the struggle, as you see, was very, very tense. In this condition, again, a better, more gradual approach, but still increasing pressure, could have broken the Normans. Instead, Alexios decides to actually attack. Right? The sense was that time was on the Byzantine side, but Alexios was instead more inclined to attack immediately. We do know that in the camp in the Byzantine camp there were different opinions regarding to this, but we can't grasp the political implications of it, because it wasn't just a matter of strategical decision, but say this field army, of course, was an enormous effort. Like keeping it on in the field would have, for a certain time rather than another, would have say entailed different. This is not so important, right? The important is what happened, is the effect with Alexios' decision, at least for what we have to describe here strategically. Alexios hoped to catch the Normans off guard, so he thought that Robert would have not crossed this stretch of sea, essentially lagoon, that connected the peninsula with the mainland. So he thought that to just amaze the Normans with his approach. And yet Robert was, as we were saying before, well aware of the enemy movements. He had sent scouts out there, some outposts, keeping him informed of the Imperial army's approach. Alexios advanced to a range of low hills opposite the Norman camp, so overlooking the entire siege on the neck of the peninsula, preparing for an attack on the Siculo-Normans on the following day. The Byzantine camp was entrenched along the higher ground, with the sea and the lagoon to its left, at a distance ahead. So it was actually a good position where to, for example, defend from, like simply attracting the Norman and simply trying to chance on a more favorable ground. Right. Instead, Alexios thought simply, let's move on. Let's go out and try to battle the Normans in the peninsula, denying them the crossing into the mainland to face us. There was even like the Byzantine camp, like a sudden steep escarpment on the right. This would eventually define the area in which the two sides could maneuver, like the field that laid ahead, like in front of the Byzantine camp. There was naturally concerted effort to, also with the Dyrrhachion garrison, to attack the Normans simultaneously. Plus, there was the Venetian fleet that was meant to land and to plunder the Norman camp had the latter had remained empty, like deserted. There was also this effort the day before the battle from the Byzantine side to attack the Norman camp simultaneously, as we'll see, from the sea, but also from the salt marshes. There is an interesting article on academia.edu that tries to locate properly the salt marshes of Dyrrhachion in 1081. So it's not just too relevant now to the battle here in the map. I didn't even insert that, but there is some, like of course the salt marshes are close to the sea immediately, and so also in some marshy ground. The point is that in order to attack the camp, they should have crossed the lagoon. So there was a bridge that allowed the Normans to cross, as we will see now at night, not to be caught off guard by the Byzantines the next day. But I don't think we know essentially what this other party, by the way, composed of some Varangians, likely the lighter element, as we will see now for some reasons from the text, there was normally the lighter troops pillaged the enemy camp during battles, right? Also because they were sort of more raiding oriented. Here, I think there may have been also some Turks, because those were the best for those tasks. And so the point was, if not attacking properly the Normans from the rear, but also in case they had crossed successfully at night, at least to deny the retreat to the camp. And so simply cutting them off from any possible reinforcement. And this is, again, from the Norman side, a pretty dire situation, because you're basically surrounded. Like, either you stand your ground and fight, or there's no way out, because the enemy field army has arrived. You're bottled in the peninsula if you stay like in the camp, and there is a garrison. There is the enemy fleet that is sealing off every route of escape. You're running out of resources, and this is why also we do not know exactly like what prompted the decision of by Alexios to attack the Normans directly. But you understand that just waiting would have likely been sort of, at least been causing severe problems to the Normans. Naturally, it's possible that the same was true for the Byzantines, that we don't have to think we're simply camping out there with everything available. Of course, every army on the field is incredibly expensive, as we were saying before, etc. And Robert of Hauteville was a very intelligent tactician. He again, we do not know about the numbers, but does it really matter? Like, the chance of facing the Byzantine field army in battle was the only chance to essentially win the strategic situation, because had that collapsed, like, basically the troops in Dyrrhachion could have not had any relief. They could have had somebody supplying them from the sea, yes, but the Normans in Italy were also sort of reorganizing, and so without like a field army coming in relief, there was nothing to do for Dyrrhachion. Doesn't matter how well garrisoned and fortified it really was. So here we arrive, in fact, to the night of October the 17th, the 18th, when the Normans moved their army out and along the peninsula, driving it up in battle order on the mainland facing Alexios. So without much further ado, let's read Anna Komnene's Alexiad, book 4, paragraph chapter 6. So this is just it. Essentially, as I was saying before, we will reconstruct the battle as it's told, so we will stop, make some consideration for the case, because even if there is some important extra information from the other sources that we will briefly read, they are shorter than this paragraph that is essentially the entire containing the battle. Like, if you read the previous ones, there is all this background, so if you're interested, you can read that as well for Besiege and so on. We will eventually still reason on this account, so that's why it's really important. So she writes, such, you see, were Robert's plans and intentions. The emperors, on the other hand, were different, more subtle and more clever. Both the leaders, however, kept, of course, because they were Byzantines, as it was her father, so it could have been otherwise. By the way, the account here, there is all a historiographical philological question. It was thought that Anna had read the main Norman account from the battle. We know that she had read her husband's account. He was a ducas that had participated to the battle and had written this history that unfortunately is lost to us, and surely she would have been quite informed as the daughter of the emperor and the wife of a prominent nobleman in that hell of an engagement about the actual events, right? But always be aware that the way the Byzantines especially wrote was very, very, say, stylistic as far as like the purpose of the work was concerned. So they were concerned, as we'll see now. It's a beautiful account. It tells a lot. It's fantastic also from a historical point of view, but It may have been organized in a way that does not want to conceal the truth, but wants to tell it in a particular way that was in the mindset of the Constantinopolitans, of like the imperial family, and so a dimension that unfortunately we cannot sort of fully appreciate or understand from our standpoint. Now, both the leaders, she says, however, kept their troops in camp whilst meditating upon their strategy and tactics, so that they might use their powers scientifically. And the emperor was planning a sudden night attack from both sides upon Robert's entrenchments. I will reread this part because they already explained, because there are some interesting details of. He commanded the whole native army to march by way of the salt pits and attack from the rear, and he did not object to their undertaking this longer march, as it would add to the unexpectedness of their attack. He himself intended to attack Robert from the front. Directly, he ascertained that his other troops had arrived. Robert, however, left his tent standing empty, and crossing the bridge by night, on October the 18th of the 5th indiction, took possession with his whole army of the chapel built long ago to the martyr Theodore, and there throughout the night they sought to propitiate the deity, and also partook of the immaculate sacred mysteries. Think about the spiritual preparation of these warriors and what these people really were. We will see now also with the infernal event of St. Michael's chapel, where the Anglo-Norse were burnt alive, and what St. Michael really was, like as an etheric figure, it was so much connected with Woden, right? And also this time that is essentially there would have been surely some pagan Norsemen from the other side, though mostly were converted, but the same Longobards, the same Normans had this quite strong connection with the cult of Saint Michael, right? You know, Mont Saint Michel in Normandy, and the sanctuary of Saint Michael in Mount Saint Angel in the Gargano Peninsula in Apulia, that now were connected even more because of the Norman conquest of southern Italy, and therefore intertwining interestingly with also with their opponents' beliefs, because you know that Saint Michael's cult was a big deal. So these angelic / etheric figures were a thing in Justinian iconography, seemingly also by Gepid influence that we see for the first time striking the figure in their midst, that also connects with the Longobards during the migration. You see that there are Franks also from the Byzantine side, so it's all that intertwined. We have a dragon in a incision on the stone in Epirus, dating more or less to this time, that is identical to the one that you see being used by the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Danish, on the Bayeux tapestry, identical, right? And of course there were lots of dragons in Europe, like we see them in Germany until the 13th century. You see from the migration era, the Draconis. I made a video about the Roman, the Daco Sarmatian dragon, like the connections also with the Far East. We will be talking about them as well. But just for telling you how also close to those ancestral, say, archetypal belief they were at the time. Also, of course, in a fully virtually entire Christian context that, however, was filled, especially from the Milithus side, with this enormous millenary symbolism of struggle and victory, of the self-sacrifice in holy combat. And just think about this preparation at night of the army before the battle. It's something beautiful and terrifying. These people knew that there could be corpses the following day, and so they had to devote themselves to the deity in the sublime fort. Then Anna Komnena writes, and there throughout the night, all right, we read it in the morning, he drew, so we're talking Robert here, up his troops in order of battle and stationed himself in the center of the line. The wing near the sea he entrusted to Amicetas. Here it's written in Greek. This was amicus of Giovinazzo. These were all essentially vassals, clients of Robert. In fact, Anna here says, specifying why it was one of the illustrious counts, brave in thought and deed. So Anna notoriously admired the Normans, the Franks, the Latins, right, for their military prowess. And the other to his son Bohemond, nicknamed Saniscus. So the Siculo-Norman deployment is very, very simple. It's just like I wanted really to make it simple also in the scheme there without adding too much. It's a single line, apparently, because who knows? Were you there? Like, this is just the count, but that's all we know. A single line, right? Robert in the center, Amicus of Giovinazzo on the right, and Bohemond of Taranto on the left. We can't think about a tripartition numerically in an equal fashion, as I decided here to make with the numbers that, by the way, the ones you see here in the deployment picture are merely conjectural. Right, so they are mines, by the way, so just my personal estimation. I think we do not know, nobody knows, but I thought that sort of this distribution would make sense. Bohemond, Saniscus, okay, so Anna writes, when the emperor learned of this, as he was clever in hitting upon the best expedient in a serious crisis, he readapted his plans in accordance with these happenings and drew up his lines on the slopes by the sea. Right, so he essentially decided to outflank initially the Normans with the entire army, making them pass through the marshes. But Robert crosses at night. Just imagine the Byzantines like at the rising sun, like realizing what had happened, and so now. The Byzantine plans, of course, it was a backup plan, changed accordingly. And so of course, the Byzantine forces line up in battle array. After dividing his forces, he did not interfere with the barbarians who were starting to make their attack upon Robert's camp. Right. So from this information, Anna tells us essentially that some of the here. By the barbarians, we mean the Varangians for what she says after, because she says, but detained those of them who carried double-edged axes on their shoulders and ordered them to discard their horses and with their leader Nabitus to march in rows. This is important. We have to read, but I mean, now we will focus on the last part because the information is quite meaningful here, but. These were the Varangians, and there may have been, as I said before, maybe other barbarians, broadly meant, especially for raiding the camp. And we understand that the guys that are retained instead by the emperor are the best ones, essentially the double-handed axes guys. I made, as you know, a couple of months ago, a video about the Varangian guardsmen of the 10th, 11th century for the historical unit series. So those are the guys that we're talking about here, and it's also in the best figure, right? And remember that many of these guys were Anglo-Danish; they came from Britain. So, in other words, there was an expendable part of the barbarians that the emperor said, "Okay, let's send them raid the Siculo-Norman camp," which is interesting because they would have had apparently to cross part of the lagoon, and we do not know how. The fact that they were lighter, because if you retain the double-edged axes guys, these are the heavier ones, the heavy infantry, and so you don't send first of all that elite and that heavy force to cross marshy areas at best. While you can spend them as we will see now, is in fact Alexios did much better against the very Norman heavy cavalry, which is very, very interesting. So it's essentially repeating what had happened at Hastings 15 years before, just 15 years and like 3 days. Hastings was on October the 14th, no, 4 days. October the 18th, Dyrrhachion. And so just I interrupted the phrase because I had to focus on this first part, but the most important information here is that Alexios detains the from the further advance those Varangians who carried double-edged axes on their shoulders. This was a way, in fact, the troops would be called, as we've seen also in the video about the Varangians, were different names for them, including the one referring to so-called Danish axe and preferential weapon of the fact of prevalently heavy infantry troops. However, some were actual horsemen. In fact, it says, and ordered them to discard their horses as well. So this tells you that, as it was also in the Anglo-Norse practice, like most of these guys would ride to battle, to the battlefield with their on their mounts, but they would dismount from them in order to fight normally, because you can't quite use a double-handed axe that easily on horseback in a functional sense. And in fact, they were infantrymen. Explicitly in this case, ordered them to discard their horses and with their leader Nabitus to march in rows at a short distance in front of the regular army. This tribe all carried shields. So you see here, Anna is expressing that sort of classicistic ethnographic bias, talking about tribes, talking about barbarians, etc. Like, so they thought they would have written in antiquity, right, defining certain things. The Franks were the Celts, right, that's similar things. This information about the shields is also like which troops wouldn't use shields really, like even with a double-handed axe, you know, that you can slang the shield on your shoulder, on the back, whatever, but of course heavy infantry used shields, as the lighter one also did, normally smaller ones. The precious information is also that this Varangians had to march in rows at a short distance in front of the regular army, right? And we see it essentially in the center of the formation, at least. I don't remember here, we will see it by reading it, but in front of Alexios, basically. Also because they were technically part of the guard, and or if there was some other element from, as we said before, like the scattered in the provinces, they would have been grouped by ethnic origin, and we see clearly who these troops were. The fact that these troops would march in rows, I don't think means much specific. I will see now that also some other information says that these guys had a two-pronged formation, but they were essentially the usual battle line array, the battle lines to array that the Varangians would normally have, like fighting on foot in a compact mass, right, of heavy infantrymen. Then Anna says, the rest of the Byzantine army lie divided into phalanxes, and himself, that is her father, took the center of the line. On his right and left he placed respectively the Caesar, Nicephorus, Melissenus, and Pacurianus, called the Great Domestic. The space between himself and the barbarians who were walking he filled with a fairly large number of soldiers skilled in archery, whom he planned to send on ahead against Robert. And so he told Nabitus, the leader of the Varangians, that when these archers wanted to ride out suddenly against the Franks and retreat again, he must immediately give them passage by withdrawing his men to either side, and then afterwards close up again and march on in close order. From here, I understand that there may have been some horse archers as well. I don't know here how we do not get a better information on how these troops were organized. It's likely it's possible. Assisting the infantry, you would preferentially have some sort of infantry as well. The most important idea here is that the Varangian units would have had to allow the missile element to ride, say, back and forth across their lines, so to essentially skirmish against the incoming enemy. Obviously, this measure was, as we'll see now, also successfully employed to keep the enemy cavalry at bay, other skirmishers at bay. And this is interesting because you have basically a heavy plus missile infantry combination in order to cope with the same Norman cavalry, which is really interesting. It's something similar to what we see at Hastings. As a matter of fact, it's rather the Normans were remembered mostly as having archers, but of course the Saxons from their top hill would have used missile weapons as well against the incoming Norman cavalry. Right here, Alexios' precaution is mostly like, let's not just make heavy infantry going without cover out there, because they are tough guys, but they need some extra protection against enemy cavalry. By the way, here we see the double-handed axemen at work. Actually, the double-bladed axemen, but the sense is that, of course, there would have been spearmen among them, because you can't really stop cavalry charges with double-handed axes. That's not how it works. Those are the best used for, if anything, finishing off cavalry after its charge is being absorbed effectively. So you can't go run at the horseman and dropping him and his horse to pieces. But it's another story. In any case, that we don't have to think to be so scientific when we read these accounts that are obviously talking about more in general terms. Then Anna writes, having rearranged the whole army in this manner, Alexios himself started along the sea coast in order to attack the Frankish army from the front. The barbarians appointed for the rear attack, after passing through the salt pits, made an assault on the Frankish camp in conjunction with the garrison of Dyrrhachion, who by the emperor's command had opened their gates. So these guys were essentially devastating the camp, as we'll see. Like the Norman sources say that that Robert had already destroyed the camp before abandoning it, so it was just all in. Like if you failed that, day was over, right, for everybody involved. As the two leaders, she says, were marching against each other, Robert ordered groups of cavalry to harass the Roman troops and thus perhaps draw away some of them. Right. This would apparently occur along the entire line. At least Halden goes a bit far, saying, this was just the center. It was a bit too much. We want to know a bit too much from what actually happened. In any case, this makes sense because it was just preliminary skirmishes. We often sort of give for granted that, Western cavalry was just about, say, shock force, but there were skirmishers. The same heavily armored horsemen were, as you know, throwing javelins, softening up the enemy ranks before charging in. Still, at this point, in the evolution, say, of medieval cavalry. This was true also at Hastings, etc. But even in this detail, Anna says, the emperor did not fail, for he kept on sending large numbers of light armed troops to oppose them. So these are general skirmishes in front of the lines. Then, after a little preliminary skirmishing on either side, as Robert was leisurely following his men, and the distance between the armies was by now fairly short, some infantry and cavalry belonging to Amicetas' phalanx, so this is the right of the Siculo-Norman host, dashed out and attacked the extremities of Nabitus' line. All right, so I represented this in the map, and basically, like, the best we get from this is that the point of attack was just an attack was on the left flank of the Varangian unit. Sort of makes sense because these Varangians, as you see here, are exposed. Right, they were proceeding ahead of the main line, and they would have presumably had like a central position. So Amicus would have had to wheel even his battle in order to attack them on their left flank, right? And the account goes on and says, so the Varangians, however, resisted the attack very stoutly, so the others turned their backs, so these were the Siculo-Normans, since they were not all picked men, this is what we were saying before, threw themselves into the sea. We'll understand this better also from the Frankish accounts, and up to their necks in the water, in water, made their way to the Roman and Venetian ships and begged them for protection, which they did not receive. Right? So these were not, of course, like if we think that it was just the entire Norman right wing, of course there would be horsemen as well as infantrymen. And so here Anna wants to say that basically there were some footmen like that were not picked troops. There would have been cavalrymen, would have not been picked troops. And she says so also to justify the fact that some of them would flee, but I can't see any reason why there would be an asymmetric distribution of troops, unless, of course, in the Norman line, right? So this is maybe just a way to justify even the faults of the enemy. Here again, these people basically break and flee towards the sea, and they try to be literally fished by the Venetians and the Byzantines, hoping that this would at least not kill them. Unlike the Byzantine left flank that at this point was presumably chasing them, except, as we'll see now, these troops basically reform at a point. And we do not know better what happens to them, but there doesn't seem to have been necessarily a complete breakthrough from the side of Byzantines. In fact, there would have not been a chance of this episode. That is, that Anna reports, says, and now, as rumor relates, by the way, Dyrrhachion, Robert's wife, this was Siculo-Gaeta, she was a Longobard princess, and you know that the southern Longobards had been, in this case it was the Duchy of Salerno, they had been in fact subjected to the Normans, in this case, and Robert had married one of these noble women of theirs. And the Longobards were a bit bloody people. So this woman was warlike herself. Anna says, we was riding at his side and was a second Pallas, if not an Athene, so stressing the fact that she was as not just warlike but also cold and sort of rational, and the actual spirit of the political military that intervenes coldly, rationally. So these soldiers running away, she looked after them fiercely, and in a very powerful voice called out to them in her own language, an equivalent to Homer's words, "How far will you flee? Stand and quit you like men," said by a woman, by the way, in arms. And when she saw they continued to run, she grasped a long spear, and at a full gallop rushed after the fugitives. And on seeing this, they recovered themselves and returned to the fight. Meanwhile, the axe-bearing barbarians, so you see, the same Byzantine source says that part of this Siculo-Norman right basically was able to rally and to actually keep on sustaining the fighting, which is quite interesting, as we do not know, unfortunately, better how the formation dynamics work, but obviously somebody else would have, on that right, would have kept holding the line. Otherwise, you could have not really come back to fight in the first place, especially if you were infantry, as most of, say, the Norman host was made of. And consider what we said before, that the Byzantines are also lighter troops in general, skirmishers, horse archers, and as we will see now, the Normans will smash into the Byzantine lines that do not quite put up much of a resistance. So where these guys who fled were, they were just part of this right wing, so we can't expect it wasn't just like a total collapse of the Siculo-Norman right wing, which actually points to the fact that the overall wing was kind of good. Also considering they had apparently ventured ahead against to meet these Varangians, because as we will understand now, the latter had yet to distance themselves from the bulk of the Byzantine army apparently, and or it's possible that they already were, because when Anna says that Alexios had deployed them just a few distance ahead, we do not know how much this is. Normally, say, battle lines in depth were spaced half a kilometer, right? So it's not just literally, also in terms of forces engagements, it's not that these battle lines were meant to simply support each other in combat. They were meant to simply be used as different lines that would be gradually thrown into the fight as a gradual reserve, energy spending, right? So for Amicus of Giovinazzo to have charged into the Varangian left, he would have had, as we've seen, just to detach himself from his position. Probably they, there is the sense that distances were quite wide, right? So that here we don't have the timing, the distances precisely, but of course every part of the army and their section of the line would behave according to maybe a pre-established plan. We do not know whether Robert had decided this ahead as a plan, or it was just the tactical contingency and opportunity. In any case, in order to perform this maneuver, Amicus would have had to properly wheel and attack on the flank, which was also, of course, sensible, because the flank attack is much more effective than one on the front, which doesn't mean necessarily that Amicus was afraid of attacking the Varangians frontally. If you look at the geometry of what we can reconstruct, simply he would have come from the flank anyway, and it's likely that the Varangians were just in front of Robert, head of the line, and so being this line in between Robert and Alexios in the broader picture, right? But the reason why Amicus troops would have been fenced off by the Varangians is not just that these were tough guys, as Anna points out, and that were supported by missile troops, and so they stood their ground with missile support and managed to repel the Norman attack. What we think that really happened here is that Gregorius Pacurianus' left wing, the Byzantine array, essentially charged against Amicus of Giovinazzo's forces, so that the latter would find himself fighting on two fronts and needing to retreat, which actually may hint also at the fact that maybe the Norman cavalry managed to hold out. We don't know enough for, as we've seen, some troops to reform, and so it wasn't just a clamorous charge, because they would lack that shock element. As a matter of fact, at least to the same degree the Normans have, even if for the sake of counterattack. It's just a broader hypothesis, as we saw before. Maybe under Pacurianus there would be some of the most shocking elements, like the Franks, the Manichaeans, which is likely also considering that normally the right wing was sort of a stronger one. It would have had sort of the best Byzantine forces, but also aside from the center where the emperor was stationed, but it depends in this sense from which kind of function, like these armies were properly conceived. Like also in Byzantine times, yes, there was some tendency maybe to asymmetry, but in many ways could have been just a classicistic sense of like the Greek, the Macedonian arrays that favored that, contrary to, for example, the Roman ones, the barbarian ones were symmetric historically. But I think that can be an idea. Those elements, especially that were more were bolder, as we've seen. Anna said literally that the Manichaeans were some fanatics, right? They were good, they were warlike, so they could be spent in that fashion, right? So we don't have any other information to explain how the enemy, let's say how the we understand the asymmetry. We're sure Anna told us that there was a right or left wing in both armies, and that there isn't much here about the Varangians being possibly like just asymmetric compared to the Byzantine center. So they were attacked on their left flank, and it's likely in the sense that the Siculo-Norman right wing was pushed by the Byzantine right wing back, but still holding their ground, because again the latter wouldn't have the necessary shock force to simply break through. So this tougher, say this heavier troops on average of the Siculo-Normans. Then Anna writes, meanwhile the axe-bearing barbarians and their leader Nabitus had in their ignorance and in their ardor of battle advanced too quickly and were now a long way from the Roman lines, burning to engage battle with the equally brave Franks, for of a truth these barbarians are no less mad in battle than the Franks, and not inferior to them. This is an old Byzantine trope. I mean, the fact that the so-called blonde-haired peoples of the Dyrrhachion, essentially the Germanics were fighting, that source says, as if they were the only people in the world who had courage, meaning that it's not that others wouldn't have courage, but that they literally acted with a bit of foolishness, risking the most, as we've seen here, how bold the same Robert was strategically, other than just tactically. And so these fanatic cavalry charges were literally just smashing in, like without that sort of more, secularized, modernized mentality that the Byzantines had been at least sticking to in that with that Greek theoretical side of the story mixed to the Roman, however, also boldness and bravery. So what is being said here is interesting, not just because of the equation of the Normans and essentially the Anglo-Norse of the Varangian Guard, but because of the fact that the latter would like to engage battle with the equally brave Franks. So even if the Varangians had been already attacked, as we've seen on the flank, and they presumably had been fencing off, as we've seen at the beginning, some waves of Frankish skirmishers, they would have essentially thought not to have engaged properly the Franks. All right, that they wanted that frontal attack, and for this reason they had essentially distanced themselves from the Byzantine array. They advanced too quickly, Anna says. In my opinion, what really happened is that they were just out there on their own, and they were to attack, in the first place, just like the rest of the army. And as we said before, again, these lines were not meant to fight together. They were just meant to be, let's say, the first one in this case, you have only two, to be sent, essentially to hopefully break the Siculo-Norman center, and in case of failure, still essentially softening up, disordering it, tiring it, so that hopefully Alexios' center would be able to overwhelm them. Also because, and again, we will see it in the end, like the Byzantines get overwhelmed apparently by the Siculo-Norman charges, and this means that they needed to soften up in a way or another. Hence also the missile troops sent by the Varangians. They wanted to optimize like the damage they could cause to the Franks, which is in part also the reason why Amicus of Giovinazzo, for example, would maybe, because of the St. Robert's will and command, try to attack these guys first, even exposing his own right flank to the Byzantine left, because maybe they were truly the most important. Like if the Varangians had not been broken early, like the St. Robert would have not had the force to simply break them and pass on to Alexios successfully. And this is really a true thing, because here, aside from the ethnic composition or whatever, we're talking about major battles that more or less equated each other, and a spent force is weak, right? And a fresher one, even if they're weaker, like the Byzantines, that could be lighter, and as we've seen, Alexios had actually good elite troops, would have overwhelmed them as well, which means the Byzantines in general, like placing the Varangians there, expected that they couldn't sort of hold like the charge of Robert's center, and that the Normans themselves thought that essentially if they managed to break in the center, they could have even done without, say, the direct defeat of the enemy right-left wings. So sort of makes sense, because once you've broken through the center, you've broken through the main line, that's also where the emperor lays, so it automatically, aside from a strictly military issue, like morally and politically, like a lot of stuff is going on. Well, you can't quite hold just with the wings, right? So that's why this is so relevant, as much as Giovinazzo's battle solidity, or at least the fact that it did break in part, but also managed to rally and to keep on fighting, which is really really interesting. And here Anna is, I think, a bit scapegoating the Varangians as well, like saying, Alex, these barbarians that are so crazy, like the Franks, that want to engage battle all the time, they're hot-blooded and whatever. But I think that this is true. I mean, truly the Varangians had this ethos for which they wanted simply to take on the enemy, scattering their body parts everywhere after having chopped them with their axes and steamrolling them or whatever. They wanted to engage face to face. Let's remember that these were the same English guys who, in part, there surely was somebody who had fought at Hastings 15 years before. We are certain of this, there is no doubt. And so they hated the Normans so much that they wanted to engage frontally, but that's also what they would have done. And here the fact that they sort of distanced themselves from the main line sort of doesn't mean much, because Alexios' center could not simply fight in the same time in which the Varangians as a unit in front of him were fighting frontally against the Franks. So also the fact that Anna says Alexios told the barbarians to stay just close to him is just a way to blame them, as opposed to her father for, whatever mistake he may have done. I mean, this was actually a good tactic for, say, aside. I presume that this story of the closeness was sort of made up, right? But even in spite of this, like, Alexios' tactics were good, but here Anna has to say, look, it's these Varangians that went to ahead by themselves. I mean, that's how battles were fought normally. Like, a line goes alone, doesn't need really the close guys in that instance to just to support them, right? Either they fight and win, or they break, and then the other line comes in. That's how all battles were fought. Like, there's no other, say, connection whatsoever. The missile troops were just in support. They're not a line, and so, as you've seen, they can't pass through the gaps of the within the same subunits of the Varangian forces. So that's also completely normal. That's also what all missile units do at all times. There is, however, an important detail that Anna makes clear, that first of all, there is this phrase. And yes, she makes it also in this phrase. She said, but the Varangians were already tired out and breathless. Robert noticed, and naturally so he thought, considering their rapid advance, their distance from their own lines, and the weight of their weapons. These are all realistic factors, after all. And he ordered some of the foot to make a sudden attack on them. This is also interesting because actually we do not know where these foot came from. There is an hypothesis here in the pictures. I essentially wanted to push for the idea that Bohemond's right, which we do not know, Bohemond's left, like Robert's left, headed by his son Bohemond, would actually flank attack the Varangians as well on the right this time, right? But we see here footmen, spearmen, so why not Normans, right? Maybe, I don't know, we just don't know, right? Maybe Anna wanted to say something, that it wasn't the great mighty Norman cavalry that did this, but it's a good hypothesis anyway. And she says, the barbarians, having been previously wearied out, proved themselves inferior to the Franks, and thus the whole corps fell. And so here she also says that basically the Franks and the Varangians were alike, right? Not really, right? The Varangians were very tough, just like the Anglo-Danish battle was, the army was at Hastings, but Norman tactics, the Western Frankish cavalry charges supported by infantry was superior in many ways. And here Anna sounds more like just because the Varangians were worn out, they were tired, and they would have been defeated by the Franks, because otherwise they were equal, as if we have the same guys that they have. And so the Byzantine Empire contains everything. We don't. There's nobody who's actually superior. Also, probably to sort of mitigate the outcome of the battle, that she also can't quite. She scapegoats someone else, including the Serbians that are apparently left, etc. She's the only source for all this stuff, but you know, in some ways it's also accurate, except for the fact that, for example, these Varangians would have simply advanced like heated and tired. Like, we do not get here the impression, like for example at Manzikert, that the Roman army had to advance the entire day under the fire of the enemy horse archers for kilometers and kilometers without coming to grip with the enemy. Here we will see from other sources that the armies essentially had spotted each other, like there wasn't much of a mystery. Like, the Varangian guard knew pretty well how to dose their own energies, like as far as their physical limits were concerned, and so I don't buy that very much as well. But you gotta understand also who is writing and why. And so here there is also the tragic end of these Varangians, because Anna says a few escaped and took refuge in the chapel of Michael, known as the captain of the host. Remember that inferic archangel symbology for also some pagans here that had identified it in many ways with Woden. We know it throughout all the migration era, the Viking era, beyond. And as many, she says, crowded into the chapel itself, and the rest climbed onto the roof, being likely in this way, they imagined, to ensure their safety. But the Latins started a fire and burned them down, chapel and all. Right? And this sounds awfully like the say the Germanic sagas. Think about the Nibelungenlied at Attila's court, when basically like the Huns and their allies set on fire the hall, and the Nibelungs resist, cutting the enemies to pieces in front of them, drinking each other's blood as all the heat of fire was making them thirsty because of their brotherhood in arms. And here it was the chapel of St. Michael, so it was all an excitement. Just dying in this context was terribly exciting. The fantasies of these people in many ways, and there are so many parallelisms in that kind of folklore that Anna Komnena was surely aware of. But also the real horrifying reality is that these Varangians basically were roasted alive. And just if you think about this in the dread of defeat, of terror, of despair, this ominous moment, and thinking about Hastings 15 years before, some of those guys relieving the dread of that bloodshed, and you can imagine all PTSDs reactivating in the moment of death itself. Like, it's terrifying, right? But also so damn epic for these men to properly die in this context, just like in the top Norse sagas. So Anna says, meanwhile, the rest of the Roman army fought on bravely. But Robert, like a winged horseman, remember this image, because this is what also the Imperium manifested on the battlefields visually in all cultures. Like this. And Anna makes a great compliment to the Hauteville here. Dashed with his forces against the Roman phalanx, draw it back and split it up into several fragments. We can imagine the Normans having already, subunits, what would become the convoy, managing to make this terrifying alternating attacks on the enemy lines, testing the back and forth, which one was the hardest. Again, also throwing javelins, as most of these heavy horsemen also had, learning which was the weakest spot in which to charge and to break the line at that point. And so here, like, Norman cavalry really manifests in the superiority of Western Frankish military culture, politics, society, etc. Here we don't have to underestimate the importance of infantry supporting also missile element and more. Anna says, consequently, some of his opponents fell fighting in this battle, and others ensured their own safety by flight. So the Byzantine line begins to shatter, to break away. But the Emperor Alexios stood fast like an impregnable tower. Beautiful image, almost like from chess. That there are, I inserted here also Charlemagne's chess, and the Byzantines were very much into, well, they had those things from themselves for a long time. These images are really very much intertwined with the same Western, say, imagery of the time. Although he had lost many of his comrades, men preeminent for their birth or military skill. For instance, Constantius fell there. So these are all people that, in fact, were notable victims of the Normans at Dyrrhachion. The son of the ex-emperor Constantine Ducas, not born while his father was still a private man, but born and reared in the purple, and deemed worthy formerly by his father of the royal fillet. There fell to Nicephorus by name, but nicknamed Cynadenus, a brave and very handsome man, who strove to surpass all in fighting that day. Right, it would always be this, sort of, individuals who wanted to prove they were, of course, like, greater than the others. Like, it was always this sense of competition within the ranks. With him the aforementioned Constantius had often spoken about marrying his sister. Nay, Nicephorus, the father of Palaiologos, and other well-known men, fell too, and Zacharias received a blow in the chest which cost him his life. Aspetus and many other picked men also perished. This really gives you really a dimension from Anna Komnena how heavy this defeat had been, actually, how many important Byzantine aristocrats had lost their lives. The battle did not come to an end because the emperor still maintained his resistance. Therefore, 3 of the Latins, one of whom was Amicetas, the amicus already mentioned, the second Peter, son of Aliphas, as himself asserted, and a third, not with inferior to these 2, took long spears in their hands and at full gallop dashed at the emperor. Amicetas missed the emperor because his horse swerved a little. The second man's spear the emperor thrust aside with his sword, and then bracing his arm, struck him on the collarbone and severed his arm from his body. When the third aimed straight at his face, but Alexios, being firm and steadfast, mind was not well dismayed, but with his quick wit grasped in the flash of an instant the thing to do, and when he saw the blow coming, threw himself backwards on his horse's tail. But just think about the equilibrism. I mean, of course, Alexios Comnenus would be trained like all these noblemen from both sides, this incredible stance on horseback. So they had also like very heavy armor in general. And the Byzantines also really came out of a very strong Western tradition. It takes a lot of physique, right, to do these things in combat, especially like a very hard mind in this incredibly dire situation. Naturally, Anna makes a beautiful portrait of her father. Thus the point of the spear only grazed the skin of his face a little, and then, hitting against the rim of the helmet, tore the strap under the chin, which held it on and knocked it to the ground. After this the Frank rode past the man he thought he had hurled from his horse, but the latter quickly pulled himself up again in his saddle, and sat there calmly, without having lost a single weapon. And he still clutched his naked sword in his right hand. His face was stained with his own blood. His head was bare, and his ruddy gleaming hair was streaming over his eyes and worrying him, for his horse in its fright spurned the reins, and by its jumping about tossed his curls in disorder over his face. However, he pulled himself together as much as possible and carried on his resistance to his foes. Soon, however, he saw the Turks fleeing, and Bodinus, this was the Serbian guy, too, retreating without having fought at all, right? This is just to say, well, it's also because of these guys that did not fight, even though at this point, as you've seen, like there wasn't, the situation wasn't really great, and that's also why they fled in the first place. So the Serbians and the Turks, so here Turks means like it can be anyone from the Pechenegs to the Anatolian, say all the various peoples who lived there, not necessarily even just Turkic peoples. This ally, Bodinus, had donned armor and arranged his army in battle order and hovered about throughout the day as if to succor the emperor, if need be, according to their mutual agreement. But evidently he was watching, purposing to help in the attack on the Franks if he saw victory inclined to the emperor, or in the contrary case to keep quite still and then beat a retreat. This being his intent, as events proved, directly he perceived that the Franks had gained a complete victory, he rode off home without having struck a single blow. The emperor, seeing this and not finding anyone to help him, turned his back upon the foe and fled. Thus did the Latins beat the Roman army. Right. And here, actually, like the thing continues with the pursuit, but it's not much about the tactical side of the story anymore. So this is the end of Anna Komnena's account. What else to say about this latter part? Well, it would be interesting to know exactly where, for example, the Turks and the Serbians were stationed, because you may never be fully sure in these battles how really deep the formations were. I mean, how many lines actually fought, because there may have been smaller ones in the reserve, like the Serbians weren't like the finest contingent that could have been put together and just individually, just by the size of their policy. So the sense is that we unfortunately never know, but let's say for Anna to say, look, this guy had his army all arrayed, and the entire day he was essentially moving as if he had to help us, but he didn't do anything. It makes you wonder where he was, right? Notice that we know nothing of the of either wings, right? So that's also from a Norman side, so that doesn't actually help much, but that's literally as few as we know. Let's pass to the account of Geoffrey Malaterra. That these are all contemporary sources. This is the deeds of Count Roger. Of course, it talks essentially from the Siculo-Norman side. These were Normans, essentially, of southern Italy. And we will read William of Apulia next, and then the analysis of Lupus Protospatarius. There was essentially an Apulian chronicler. Right? From Bari, he was essentially Byzantine by culture, even though it's called Lupus, which is also like Latin, and so makes you understand the thing. Just more brief note. Let's read Geoffrey, and let's try to especially compare to the more complete account of Anna Komnena. This says, the next day, October having now arrived, at the first light of dawn, part of our army was preparing to set out in search of food, when they realized that the emperor was approaching with a huge army, the standards fixed to the tops of their lances being visible, flapping in the distance. The guy is very visual in description. There was much commotion and noise in the camp. Some were terrified. Others, more resolute in their hearts, rendered the less valiant ones more robust, restoring them with their encouragement. So the sense is, as we said before, that there was a differential in the level of bravery, depending on the troops. Like the Norman knight would have been, of course, just a different thing, like a professional war machine de facto, as opposed to, I don't know, the average, as we've said before, like Byzantine or Longbird militiaman, a farmer, just levied for occasion of the campaign. By the way, Geoffrey, it's actually Godfrey, it's preferred to pronounce, Gaufridus Malaterra, right? He was a Benedictine monk, to be more specifically, and he lived some time in Apulia, sometimes in Sicily. So he has also this more, general cut, right? To also the spiritual dimension, so on. Then he goes on and says, seeing that the battle was imminent, the Duke, so here it's referring to Robert as the Duke of Apulia and Calabria. You know that the Count of Sicily was his brother Roger. They were sharing power within the dynasty. The Kingdom of Sicily proper would come just later on in the 12th century institution. Seeing the battle was imminent, the Duke burned all of his ships, right, so as to inflame his men all the more ardently with regard to their own defense by removing any hope of flight. He did this so that when they found themselves in the midst of a violent battle, the timid would not turn away from the fight and flee to the ships in the hopes of sailing away. The emperor, arriving at a point not far from our men's camp, that is about 4 stadia, which is like 125 paces or 625 feet, all right? So it's something like, in this case, 800 meters, something from that. However, the distance was actually greater, right? It was kilometers, like it's just here to say that they were very close in general. He positioned his army all around, but on that day no one from his army dared to do anything against our men, and no one from ours dared to do anything against them. The following evening the Duke had the first watch of the night. His son Bohemond had the second, that is, from midnight until dawn. When morning came, the Duke himself, in the dim light, roused all of our men, and they, with great devotion, heard hymns and the celebration of the Mass. After confessing their sins to the priests with compunction, they armed themselves with the mysteries of the Holy Eucharist. This is also why we think that Anna may have been reading these sources. Then, after the battle lines had been organized, they gradually moved forward as a group to the battle. Then, after the battle lines had been organized, they gradually moved forward as a group to the battle. Their emperor, hurrying to meet them, was surrounded by so great an army that no mountain seemed high enough to provide a full view of its extremities. The Angles, whom they called Varangians, so here properly like the Anglo-Saxons, they were full of Anglo-Saxon refugees. The Varangian Guard at this point had requested from the emperor the most advanced position in the battle, which, as we've seen here, is said in a way that sort of makes more sense, because the Varangians were also more less dependent than it seemed from the emperor. At least they would be very much. They were very faithful and all, but there were surely more. And as a battle line, they were also pretty consistent. Like in their position, like of course made sense, as we've seen. Behind the Byzantine array, the rest of the Byzantine array in the first line, because they knew also they would make sense themselves in that position, was one of honor, but also had its logic. Once the struggle began, the Varangians rushed into the fray with a two-pronged formation that was typical of this nation of powerful men, and at first proved to be difficult for our men to handle. Right, but when one of our battle lines burst forth with a violent attack against the unprotected flank of the Varangians, it forced them to flee, wounded and completely terrified. This account makes you understand why we think that Anna Comnena may have read the Siculo-Norman sources, right? Because she says similar things, also in the narrative scheme, and this part, like she says, remember that there were some footmen that were attacked, that attacked the Varangians on the flank after Amicus had already done it on the other. And here, Godfrey literally says that one of our battle lines, like it's generic, but it could have been as well, again, the left wing of Bohemond, even though he talks about Bohemond and he doesn't properly say like it was him, because it would have been sort of epic, right, if it had happened, but we think it may have been a thing, and this is what breaks the unprotected flank of the Varangians, that in this sense what is unprotected, also that the other flank was unprotected, but they managed to repel the enemy, which is a feat to pull off as far as we've seen. Like, you're not normally deployed to receive attacks on the flank. That's why Anna says that plausibly, like the Varangians had been provided properly with lighter troops supporting them, missile fire to cope with the Norman cavalry. And here it seems even as if the Varangians had already engaged frontally with someone. All right, so there are different ways of here, like specifically thinking when is that they broke specifically, after how long they had been fighting, in which part of the battlefield, and what holding off presumably Norman cavalry charges. This flank attack sounds like, again, like they were engaged against Robert's line, and probably they were pinned in the sense that they would have not charged frontally cavalry, even though, at this point, cavalry is not completely decisive. On battlefields yet, you have to wait another century for that, but they would have presumably stood their ground against cavalry charges. So they were possibly attacked. That's why the idea of Bohemon's left wing attacking is sort of interesting, because it may have really been about pinning them with the center and then breaking them with a flank attack, right? And that would have essentially taken out so many different good levels, you see. And if, as Haldon says, the Varangians were just as few as 1,400, why would this battle account suggest that when the Varangians broke on an army of 15, 20,000, that simply everything fell apart in the first place, right? It's not that, again, it's unlikely that with this consistency also the Byzantines would have even given battle, right? And here there is another, say, because Godfrey says the Varangians sought asylum in a church dedicated not to St. Michael but to St. Nicholas, which was located nearby, but while some were able to enter the church, it was not big enough to accommodate all of them. Many were forced to climb into the roof, so this is exactly what Anna Komnena says. So many, in fact, that it collapsed under their weight, crushing and suffocating those inside. Anna Komnena is more poetic about that. And Godfrey maybe wanted to shame a bit the Varangians. We don't know, because naturally the Normans hated the Anglo-Norse a bit more. And seeing the Varangians in whom he had placed his greatest hope for victory, by the way, this is very important, overcome so easily, and seeing our men advancing against him with such force, this is Alexios, the emperor was frightened and chose to flee rather than fight. Alright, it's also a bit of a different version from Anna that says how long her father had stood his ground, which is also plausible, at least. But here it's another tone. It's just perhaps Anna answering to this very source and saying, this is not really how it went. My version is better. If I write it better, it will go down history more. And so that Schwerpunkt will make a video, telling my account first, basing the battle on it. Well, yeah, that's how it happens, but we can easily see the correspondence here. Each and every member of the Greek army hastened to be the first in flight. In the process, they left behind their tents and all of their belongings. Victorious, our men pursued the fleeing enemy for a short distance until they were called back by the Duke. This is interesting, because probably with all those Turks around, as we've seen the Turks and the Serbians that Anna says fled without fighting. Well, that was a fresh force after all. Maybe they could set up an ambush, the heavy cavalry could be easily caught at their cut off out there in the open, right? And that's why Robert wanted to be sure that it wasn't a trap, etc. This also looks very much like the Byzantines were much more of an Eastern thing to the Western eyes, right? This was normally a problem you had when fighting the Turks. You didn't know how many were there out there, just like the Byzantines did not fully know at Manzikert until dawn, and possibly also later. So this is a bit the same way for a heavier contendant that would have seen the Byzantines in that sort of more Eastern fashion. And as we've seen by the 11th century, were so many especially Asiatic light horsemen in the Byzantine armies themselves, that that could have been the case. Ambushes, hit and run tactics, feint flights, And returning toward their camp, the Duke took up residence in the Emperor's tent, while the others, on a first come served bases, took for themselves the most precious camp lodgings and spoils. They sacked the Byzantine camp. Yeah, basically there is some other detail, but this goes on just without tactical details. Then this is instead the famous Gesta Roberti Guiscardi, so the deeds of Robert Guiscard, by William of Apulia, Guilelmus Apuliensis, the famous Norman poet and chronicler. Is writing in the 90s of the 11th century. This is the night before the battle. Alexios ordered the people of Dyrrhachion to attack the enemy in the rear, that they might be safe neither in the front nor behind. At daybreak, the Duke prudently burned his camp to prevent anybody attacking it once he had marched out. You see, Anna Comnena said that actually the Byzantines would manage to loot the camp. How much was it technically destroyed, how much was left there, we do not know. It seems as if they are making a bit of propaganda for both sides, like altering a bit reality. But the truth always lays in between somehow. Like, at daybreak, the Duke permanently burned his camp to prevent anybody attacking it once he had marched out. He was the first to, which sort of doesn't make much sense. I mean, who cares at that point? Of course, they would have destroyed it, or rather to not to leave anything to the enemy, making them a favor of some sort. But it was just the camp. Like if they had lost the battle, everything would have been lost anyway. He was the first to lead his troops out to battle. Alexios moved out a great many units and attacked him. The Calabrians and Lombards, and that's where we get the thing like of the weaker element, were terrified, and almost all the sailors the Duke commanded took flight. Right, so this is interesting because from one side it tells us that it's the Byzantines who attacked first, but as we'll see later, it sounds as if the battle had not even sort of began. So this could actually fit the attack of Amicus of Giovinazzo that we saw before, and definitely the account of Siculo-Gaeta that will appear here, chasing the fugitives. And the Calabrians and Lombards were this southern Italian natives that would have been, as we've seen, just the militias, so the ones with lower morale, and so they would have collapsed. But here it also says, and almost all the sailors the Duke commanded took flight. Of course, there were some broader, like Italian sailors that were sort of sometimes even lighter type of infantry, skirmishers, whatever, could of course disembark and fight on foot. Some were heavy infantry proper, but in general they were mostly lighter, and they would accompany the heavier Norman knights. And there, of course, there were heavily armored troops among them and tougher ones, but overall, like the numerical majority in the segmentation, also in the cavalry, were lighter, were not the heavily armored, metal armored tough guys, right? So these are the guys who flee, right? And even the Duke's knights were scared by the first attack of the enemy, crashing down upon them. So this seems, however, as if there was an enemy attack, rather than, again, we don't know whether it's Bacurianus, Byzantine left wing, or it's the Varangians that are advancing centrally, and we don't get it. In any case, this would mean different things from what Anna Comnena told us, at least potential. After crossing the river, so you see there's talk about this regarding the lagoon that had here, not actually the lagoon, it's actually a river. We do not no, I don't think there is any specific evidence of this. There would have been some brooks, something like coming to the sea. But here the source insists, as we'll see now, on the fact that it was a closed field, like one that would not allow the Siculo-Normans to be fully well deployed, right? We're a bit boxed into this ground. It says, after crossing the river, they came heedlessly into an area where space was very restricted. The Duke had had the bridge demolished to prevent anyone from the town making a sortie against him or anybody entering the town. So again, it would be interesting to know how the outflanking Byzantine troops would have, those circling around, would have actually crossed those marshes, unless they were amphibious troops of some sort, which is possible. Again, the Varangians would have had some of that as well, but not only them. The narrowness of this area hindered his men's advance, and a furious cloud of missiles covered them from every side. It was said that nobody had ever seen a greater storm of arrows, which suggests again that the Byzantines had a lot of horse archers at least. Since there was no place of safety, for they could neither fight nor retreat, they tried to deploy and threw themselves into the sea, because the press was such that the Normans were getting into the way of their own men and hindering them just as much as the enemy was. So perilous a position seemed to panic the Normans. So again, it's not broader battle movements out there, amicus of Giovinazzo's attack and all this stuff. Here the guy insists on the fact that this ground was tough, that apparently the Byzantines were sort of skirmishing. In a sense, William of Apulia is apparently maybe the least reliable of the sources, unless he's referring to something that at least the other did not contemplate. We shouldn't underestimate him, of course, at all. So perilous position seemed to panic the Normans, thinking them to be vanquished and retiring, and with the Venetian fleet cruising nearby and hoping to capture the defeated, the imperial army, eager for booty, started looting. They captured the horses and other baggage which the Duke's army had abandoned when they had rushed out to fight, so not everything had been destroyed. Meanwhile, a crowd of Normans managed to wade out of the sea and rejoin the Duke, who had, being in the lead, been among the first to escape from this very dangerous spot, albeit with considerable difficulty. So this would be the ones that were rallied by Siculo-Gaeta, apparently. And so it goes with the idea that they had reached the sea, some of them had even tried to reach the Venetian ships, etc. But they managed sort of to come back. This would have been, again, the lighter elements of the host, and as we've seen, probably these either Calabrian, Lombard, or just Italian sailors that had the lower morale as footmen, as commoners. It's very dangerous, Paul Bedford. So the original deployment which he had laid down for his troops had disintegrated, for the appalling constriction of the field had changed everything. But the Duke rejoiced that his men were present, and he promptly gave them a few words of encouragement, telling them that they would find safety only in their weapons, and threatening them that if they had turned their backs on the Greeks, they would have all be slaughtered like sheep. Sort of makes a lot of sense, like we're here to fight or die, essentially. He told them that a prisoner's life was just the same as death. With these exhortations, he fired his men's courage. Even though he saw the vast numbers of Alexios' army coming towards him, he trusted in the banner given him by the Pope in honor of Peter. Remember always the fact that the Normans had been entrusted with the reconquest of the Islamic territories of Sicily as a veritable crusade, and at this point, the Byzantines were almost seen as no better, right? At least in terms of like the antipathy towards the Pope. So honor Peter, the Prince of Shepherds, and in the merits of Saint Matthew, for whom he had built a church. He charged boldly on the enemy and engaged in a ferocious battle not far from the besieged city. So here it sounds even as if up to this point, the battle had not even began. Right? And this is it, right? It says Alexios was defeated and his men turned tail, for more than 5,000 of the Greeks were killed in this engagement. A huge number of Turks perished with the Greeks. All sorts of splendid arms, horses, and standards were captured from the Greeks. Also, barely 30 knights from the Duke's army were counted to have been killed, which is probably an exaggeration, but considering they were elite, right, they may have... We often find this numbers, like this was a crushing Siculo-Norman victory. And of course, like for 30 knights killed, still you have, imagine, like at least 100 wounded, and that's possible in terms of even other hundreds of infantrymen having become casualties as well. So it's not that inaccurate, telling the truth. Alexios wept to have been defeated by an enemy inferior both in numbers and in wealth, which also goes against the idea that the Normans were more than the Byzantines, right? He himself was wounded and retired. The man who had vainly hoped to celebrate a spectacular triumph was forced instead to make a tearful and inglorious return. During this battle, Robert's wife had been wounded by a chance arrow, which also tells you how it could happen really for presumably a heavily armored woman, as we've seen, as Siculo-Gaeta's fiery spirit would have allowed her to be next to her man. And so here there's not the connection of her actually rallying those broken troops, but still the story went. And again, it's also possible that, of course, the Byzantines would send these parties of horse archers to harass the troops while they were deploying. God knows how things went. Like, it's likely that Robert would have taken measures at night also to deploy in time, like the troops at dawn, and it's all before, like, just already deploying them adequately without sort of getting bogged down in the terrain. But God knows how it really went, right? And terrified by her wound, speaking of Siculo-Gaeta, and with no hope of assistance, she had very nearly fallen to the enemy, and, afraid that she was in imminent danger of death, had wanted to embark on one of the ships. But God, who did not want to embarrass so noble and worthy a lady, had rescued her. Constantine, who had previously been stripped of his royal rank, died in this battle. He was buried. So you see, this surely there was something like the stories would be circulating, read between southern Italy, the Balkans, etc. They would be somehow interdependent. We see some episodes, some names, like in this case, that make us understand that yes, these were actual things that happened at the time. The Greeks lost many of the leading men of Dyrrhachion, whose bodies lay unburied and rotted on the battlefield. Just imagine the spectacle, by the way, and that was always the thing, getting also out of there, burying them in time before they would start literally like exploding, because that becomes like a place we can't properly step in. And as we've seen, the Normans had actually already lost some men. It says 500, I don't remember, there is a figure, but this is also why we don't think that the Normans were so many after all. We're told again they had suffered some loss just during the siege, right? So it's an important thing. So this is it, right? And finally, we read the account of the aforementioned Lupus Protospatarius, or Protospatari, because this was meant to be the Lupus of Protospatarius. That was as if like a surname, but a patronymic, right? And here, the guy, by the way, doesn't place the... this is also a source from the same era, but he places the battle wrongly at 1082, and it's it's very short, like indizione quinta, hoc anno complenur. Okay. Et hoc anno Alexios imperator collecto grandi exercitu init bellum cum Roberto duce haud longe a Dyrrhachion et terga versus fugit. So it's that simple, but the important information we will analyze together with the others is the actual number of losses that were not told otherwise. Cercidurent in ea pugna pleus quam 6 milia ex suis, which means that the Byzantines lost 6,000 men. And says, of course, that in mensa Januari of the year after, Robertus dux cepit civitatem Dyrrhachium, traditione quarundam Veneticorum. And so, yes, of course, after the battle, the Normans, as you see here, actually, the garrison holds out for some other months because it was strong, but eventually the Venetians apparently, like a Venetian within the city, opens the gates, and this is also kind of normal because at that point nobody would have come rescue them. Also because the enemy army was disintegrated, the Norman one was intact, and so as you know, they would go on pillaging as far as Thessaly, Greece, and so on. I talked this in another video. What can be said about this battle? So we don't talk about the consequences, again, that's for other types of videos. More or less what we had to say, we said, right? There is this idea that I find it very fascinating of the possibility of the otherwise unknown, or at least not really covered during the battle by the sources, left wing of the Siculo-Norman army actually launching a flank attack with cavalry, more sensibly, against the Varangians. Also because, yes, Amna Comnena uses the term of spearmen as footmen, translated, but a flank attack, especially if you have a lot of Norman cavalry, would be better carried out in that fashion. But also the fact that Bohemond is not named in all this, which is strange, because of course he was already powerful as Robert's son and bold commander and all. Like, yeah, nobody knows what happened on that Siculo-Norman left and Byzantine right. Nobody knows. Here, any other consideration, Haldon says, there was no discipline, and in the Byzantine manuals they were telling just to, they were too much about pursuing the enemy and detaching themselves. What does this have to do really with the Varangians, right? As we've seen, not even Pacorianus on the left pursued Amicus of Giovinazzo as he should have, right? So it's not true. I disagree with him. Here what appears clearly is that the Norman heavy cavalry charge was something that doesn't seem to have really found much of a counterpart, of a mean of contention frontally in open field. Like here, whatever the Byzantines had from the other side was basically run over, right, by the Normans. By the way, in all this, you see that we lack the decisive moment. The idea is that when everybody agrees that the Varangians were wiped out, right, or at least that they broke, so that they wouldn't necessarily all die, right? But there is the episode in the church, the massacre of the Varangians there, but we're not really told what happens afterwards. The idea is that Robert's force would have, at that point, barely been spent, and so they could have attacked frontally Alexios' line, which would have been sort of more obvious than any other option. Again, we do not know what happens on the northern side of the battlefield. On the right, also, it seems that the Normans had almost lost, actually. So it was probably mostly on the center that all of this was, like, all the burden was weighing. So it's not to say even that like the Normans weren't risking to lose that battle till the last. But we definitely see some qualitative superiority in their cavalry and their charge, and there wasn't again, much of a countermeasure other than the toughness of the Varangian heavy infantrymen that, however, got overwhelmed by that. Too, as well as the mobility, rather than the idea that they had been spent or they were tired or whatever. They were broken by a skillful tactical maneuver by the Normans. Flank attacks will become really, had always been the norm, like the fact that they would appear more openly, better described in the 13th century doesn't mean they weren't there, and that they weren't actually a great part of this, especially cavalry, heavy cavalry tactics already quite early. And so also here the myth that the flank attack was brought from the Crusades meant the Normans already had it here, right, from Europe. Also, it's interesting the reference to the Italian infantry, which essentially broke at this first attack, and it seems that especially there was a lot of missile fire coming from the Byzantine side, aside from the various movements that we could think of, because again, if we speak in more collective terms, a flank attack by Pacurianos on Amicus' right, in turn attacking the Varangian left, would have broken the entire formation anyway, and so surely also many cavalrymen broke and fled. But the idea is from these other sources that these troops couldn't hold their ground, apparently because of missile fire, and it's possible that the Normans would have used, as it happened also during the Crusades, the infantry to shelter the cavalry, and especially the horses were largely unbarred, right? And that made a lot of sense. As we've seen, some horses had been preserved also in the camp because they were so expensive, right? It's just like you have a private jet or a yacht, right? In actual wealth equivalents. And so it's possible that these infantrymen were, especially the militia, but I mean, let's not exaggerate, it would have been heavily armored troops who would make the front ranks, but still they would have been exposed more to missile fire, and so some of them would have broken more easily, especially the commoners, the militiamen, under such intense fire that, however, managed to absorb a lot of that. We can imagine preemptive Byzantine softening up of the Norman lines because they didn't have much other, let's say, chance. Like they had to spend that missile before the main engagement began. So actually, also Godfrey's account does. Yes, also that. But I mean, William's one about this initial difficulties of terrain regrouping may have been connected with the insidious horse archery out there, and actually. Again, the Italian infantry that the Siculo-Normans had was better than Byzantine infantry, right? That doesn't even quite seem to appear there. And considering that, like, there would have been large amounts also of horse archers or mounted troops from the Byzantine side, like that's also a sizable force in general, right? You have to be wary of. We see from both sides there are people killed or wounded by missile. The same Siculo-Gaeta from the Norman side. Those other guys also during the siege, of course. So there's all indicators of the fact that even though, of course, there was a heavy shock element from both sides, it would decide matters. There was a lot of missile fire going on, right? Regarding the losses, as we've seen, we're told the only numbers we're aware of, the Normans losing 30 knights killed, whereas the Byzantines losing up to 7,000. So if you consider something like 20,000 from the Byzantine side, that's almost 1/3 killed, which is not really very plausible because all the others would have had to be wounded in some way. So, but we can imagine that casualties from the Byzantine side were very, very high, right? We are looking here at a complete break, a complete collapse, right? And so, albeit we do not know exactly which numbers, you can see the Varangians suffering heavy casualties, part of the Byzantine army fleeing without fighting. Alden says there are 5,000 losses. Casualties, he says, right? That would account for 1/4 of the entire army. We do know also from the following campaign, the Normans invade again Thessaly. They threaten the stability of the empire. That the Byzantines had more of these horse archers to carry out hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla, scorched earth, all this stuff. That there was no army available anymore in terms of heavier elements of that size that we see at Dyrrhachion. And so again, I don't even understand why some authors say that the Byzantines would have been outnumbered. Doesn't make much sense, even intuitively. They wouldn't have this huge army. Sure, they were short of troops, but I mean, also the Normans didn't have this infinite amount of troops. They had to yet be fully established in, at least in Sicily. There were some parts of southern Italy, at least they hadn't also properly, they had occupied, but they were yet to mold well in. So, again, the numbers I gave you, say 13,000 from the Siculo-Norman side, say between 15 and 20,000 from the Byzantine ones. They're sort of the thing. It's a big engagement for the time. We don't see much else in this sense. I think it's a beautiful battle. It doesn't say anything clamorous regarding what we already know about the warfare of the time, but it still shows the degree of dependency that the Byzantines had grown. Also, the general advancement of the West compared to the Byzantine Empire, like the great crisis that had struck the empire in the 11th century, the fact that the West was literally booming, the fact that the Venetians at this point are contracted probably like the entire maritime force of the empire, so many privileges that were unprecedented, really losing their independence as far as those means were concerned, and these were Latins, right? So allies or enemies, you're sort of giving ground to them. The Normans eventually, they would also become essentially the most advanced country, especially in the 12th century. Like Sicily is really the center of Europe in terms of prestige or power. It's also true for like the southern Italy for the first half of the 13th century. It's really a huge deal. Of course, the central and northern Italian communes are already ahead, right? But this is an entire kingdom. There's a court, right, representatively in comparison to Constantinople. That's also an important competitor and comparison. So this battle sums well up all the great dynamics of the time, including this fantastic Norman cavalry that really embodies at this point some of the highest levels of Western military superiority, and that also the Byzantines estimate the same. Anna Comnena actually falling in love with Bohemond of Taranto when they showed up later on during the crusade. There was a lot of enmity, hatred, but also sort of admiration and even respect, depending on the circumstances. And it's really interesting, as always, to read the sources to appreciate what these authors really thought and believed. And again, I don't want to make the video too long, also because at a certain point, I have technical limits, to have the entire audio track for a single video. But so this was it, right? We will talk more about, of course, Norman, Byzantine warfare, the period. There is really a lot to cover. But and it feels a bit bad just to leave you like this for such a huge battle. But we will keep talking about it. We will surely deepen some certain other aspects. This was it, right? These engagements are important. They can get mythologized, but at the same time they are this much in terms of documentation, and we have to appreciate also in this primitive times, like, to have this much available for reconstructing, after all, the battle fairly well, after all. Again, things could have gone differently. We do not know 100% how things went, but there is all in this sort of Balkan Hastings, and also that dramatic sort of rise of the West, of the Franks, of the Latins, the surpassing, the end of the Viking era, the feudalism, feudal states, right, and all their advancement, reigning supreme, and also, as we've seen, this communes, right, the maritime expansion, the thing that would go in parallel during the Crusades in terms of expansionism, the papacy behind this, as we've seen, and so truly an affirmation of the Latin Germanic world on what had remained out and what had not yet found, in some cases, a settlement, in others that had sort of been sclerotizing, having some issues, and actually becoming increasingly dependent on the same Westerners. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.